All right, welcome back to another episode of Kherson Weekly. We are going to be covering the events of 10th November to 16th November. Let's take a look. Okay, so we'll do the usual read along with you guys. We'll watch the videos and discuss. Okay, so, Kherson Weekly, 10th to 16th November 2025. 98th VDV, human safari strikes, mass remote mining, drone data, and civilian casualty updates. You can see here, this is a car struck by a drone earlier this week. I believe it was on the 11th of November that happened. Again, as always, please, guys, donate to Anti-Human Safari so that we can help get drone detectors. They are working towards their goal. They've made a little more progress um, towards their goal of closing out that last 1,000 euro before December. So not much time left before they want to wrap the fundraiser up, but hopefully we can reach that goal and close this out. Okay. Terror from the Left Bank. No video of the week today. We're just going to jump right into the war crimes. Again, from Recon Group Dnepr, we saw the Recon Group continued striking civilian vehicles west of Kherson City this week. Luckily, no civilians were reported as suffering injuries this week in Bilizerka from enemy drones. Artillery shelling did wound 8 civilians over the course of the week, however. There we go. Fixed. Did wound 8 civilians over the course of the week, however. Let's watch the video and. So it just said automobile equipment. Okay. We had a geolocation by Dominic on this. If we take a look, it was in Bilizerka, so you can see this like very characteristic um, intersection on the 16th of November. So if we go to Andrew's map here, we'll be able to see that over in Bilizerka. Whoops, might be on the 17th. 15th, sorry. Here. We can see this is the same area that they attacked last week. We went over a strike on a van that happened right here last week. So you can see they're still focusing on this same intersection, trying to choke off key logistics routes by focusing drone attacks specifically on certain sections of road rather than trying to control the whole town or the whole city with a drone group. You can use the drone group to do the same thing just by controlling access to the city. And so it's much like sort of your medieval to like early modern siege tactics where you post up outside the city and cut the city off from logistics. Um, that's what's going on here. But instead of doing it with like digging parapets and setting up walls around like a wall city and kind of like besieging a city in a traditional like military sense, historical military sense, they're using the drones to do that instead. So you can kind of execute similar goals from like what you could see in like historical examples of warfare with drones. Now it's not always super effective because right, like you have to keep a certain number of drones over this area. You have to constantly keep resupplying at the that point, so it allows you to besiege the city from afar. Right, it's very different than like a traditional siege where you would be like manning parapets surrounding an enemy city. and walling in the walls, more or less, is how it used to work. So it's not like a one-to-one comparison, but you can kind of accomplish the same goals. Okay, so we saw that there. Now, most of the geolocated strikes that we had, drone strikes, like most of Osvidomitil Alex's footage these days is not drone strikes, it's actually artillery strikes throughout the city. But most of the drone strikes, the human safari drone strikes that we're starting to see now, are coming from the 98th Guards Airborne Division, specifically from this channel, Rodnaya 98. So, Rodnaya is like family. Um, so here we have the 98th Guards Airborne Division sharing a series of drone strike videos this week. Various geolocations from Ukraine Daily Update map show the 98th is actively striking from roughly Dniprovsky Rayon in Kherson City to Ivanivka in Beryaslav Rayon. This reveals that the 98th's deployment in Kherson is essentially a one-for-one replacement to free the 104th Division for offensive operations. So if we recall, right, 104th Airborne Division, Air Assault Division, was active roughly from like Kozachi up to the dam. And what we have now is essentially like these guys are active from like Ivanivka all the way into Dniprovsky Rayon, right? So if we take a look here, yeah, on the 15th, we see this SUV, this police SUV, destroyed in Antonivka. And at the same time, we're also seeing artillery shelling from the 98th all the way up in Novotyakhinka, which is that's pretty far up. So they're covering a fairly wide front, right? And they're striking fairly deep, right? So if we want to use the map, right, let's go from like Pidstepna to Darivka, right? So we're getting like 10 kilometers deep from Pidstepna, the center of Pidstepna. Likely the Russian pilots are launching from a bit further back. But if we try and like map this front out, I guess we can just do like a straight line from Dniprovsky Rayon to Novotyakhinka. Yeah, we can see basically like almost a 30-kilometer piece of front for the whole division to cover. So it's a larger deployment than what was going on with the 104th, where the 104th Air Guards Air Assault Division were pretty much doing like, I guess 25. Wow, really? Optical illusion. I guess it's something like 5 kilometers shorter, so not all that much. But we did see them striking deeper. The 104th were striking as deep as Vysoke. Haven't seen strikes deep into the rear of this area just yet. Not visuals of those strikes like we got from the 104th. So the 98th is essentially responsible for that area and replacing the 104th. On the 15th, the 98th's 215th Reconnaissance Battalion was responsible for an FPV strike on a Kherson police service vehicle. The officers are non-combatants, often rendering medical aid to wounded civilians or evacuating civilians from frontline settlements. 6 service vehicles were destroyed by Russian forces this week. And let's take a look. So we can see 2 police officers. And we have the strike on the Toyota Land Cruiser. And then a second police vehicle is hit from behind, another Toyota Land Cruiser. Actually, it's the same one. You can see the front of the vehicle is destroyed from the first drone strike. But it looks like maybe it was artillery shelling that occurred on the other side of the railroad tracks there. Okay. But we do have a geolocation for this. We had just talked about in Antonivka on Ukraine um, map. Right here. So we have strikes in Bilizerka, strikes in Antonivka from Dnieper and the 98th. Now we'll be moving on to the 16th. On the 16th, we saw the 98th Unmanned Systems Battalion use a FPV drone to strike a van that was parked under a net shelter underneath the bridge connecting the Beryslavska Highway and National Guard of Ukraine Avenue, located between Dniprovsky and Tavrisky rayons. And we can see that here on the map. So if we take a look, we have this strike under this bridge here. You can see this bridge moving into the interchange to get on the Beryslavsky Highway right here, coming from this rotary or traffic circle or whatever you call it. I call it a rotary. Let's watch the video. So we're seeing an FPV drone. Strikes through the net. And it's captured by another FPV doing a BDA assessment. Okay, again on the 16th, two men driving and the 16th is when this was released. We don't know precisely when these events happened. We'll get into why that's important in just a second. Two men driving a chemical cleaning company van near Derivka escaped from their vehicle before a Vandal drone from the 217th Airborne Regiment struck the front of the vehicle. The driver ran behind the vehicle while the passenger appeared to attempt to line up a shot on the incoming drone with a shotgun, seemingly used in sport or hunting. Russian forces previously wounded an 83-year-old man in a drone attack in the same area on 11th November. It's possible that Russian forces published footage a few days later, and therefore it is also possible that the man with the shotgun sustained injuries, and he is in fact this very same 83-year-old man. So let's take a look at that. Here you can see the driver run to the back, the guy with the shotgun runs to the side, and you can see the drone hit and angle up before it actually detonates, or we assume it detonates. One thing that we've noticed recently is Vandal drones have been having some issues with detonating. Excuse me. So there could be a possibility that this is a older event released a couple days after it actually happened. Given, and the only reason why I say this is we don't have any other reported instances that match the description of this one. So this is a situation where we have footage and only one piece of footage that matches such an incident, and where we only have one incident that's ever been reported by the other side, and they seem to match. So I do think, I do think that there is a fair likelihood that this is a confirmed attack on civilians, given the nature of the vehicle they were driving, and given the report that we have. I'm pretty sure the person with the shotgun, or the driver, I'm more inclined to feel like it was the person with the shotgun, given the proximity to the drone, and given the fact that the drone warhead actually angles upward a little bit before it detonates, meaning that he could really be on the receiving end of some shrapnel there, especially if he's still standing up. If he's lying down, perhaps not as much, but definitely if he's standing up. And it was reported specifically in Derivka by Kherson ODA and the Kherson police as being on the highway near Darivka. So I'm inclined to believe that we have a match here. And I'll show you guys on the map here what we got going on. Here is our intersection. So again, you can see, right? Like this idea of choke points is really important for Russian drone groups now. The 98th is picked up on this this tactic. It wasn't used by necessarily all of the drone groups that have been in Kherson. Choke points weren't necessarily used by all of them. Some of them were a little more amateur in terms of how they were, a little more random in terms of how they chose to attack targets. But the 98th appears to be choosing specific choke points to attack. Choke points, well, and Nepper group as well. So you're cutting off eastern and western access into the larger area. And also, like you can see, there's a cluster of attacks right here, right along the highway. So again, like this is an area where vehicles will be exposed, potentially trying to get on, change onto the highway. Lots of turns. You have to slow down for turns. So places where you have to slow down for turns become exploitable choke points for drone teams. That's something we see with like Rubicon in Donetsk Oblast regularly. All right, let's talk about drone data. So we didn't talk about drone data last week because I wanted to kind of do both this week. I wanted to see how things changed, if they changed at all. So really, like almost no drop, like a negligible drop, really. 40 drones difference between um, last week and this week. But if we take a look at effectiveness, right? Um, we saw overall more attacks within the Kherson urban Ramada, and we saw the effectiveness rise by about 10% on the interception rate by Ukrainian forces. The reason for that is if we take a look at the data, and I'll show you guys in a second what's going on here. The week before, the week of the 3rd to the 9th, we saw that they didn't have a typical amount of success outside of Kherson urban Ramada. We saw a pretty significant drop, and we'll get into the statistic values of that in a second. But things evened out this past week, while inside Kherson urban Ramada, the interception rate pretty much stayed like at 95%. The Ukrainian CUAS data for Kherson from 2 weeks ago saw a major dip in effectiveness of Ukrainian anti-drone operations outside of Khersonska urban Ramada, which then improved this last week. Effectiveness fell into the mid-70s while finishing in the mid-90s. While inside the city proper, interception rates held steady in the mid-90s both weeks. Ukrainian CUAS operations continue to hold Russian SUAS strike success to 5 to 10%. Slight tweak I want to make. Let's make that edit. There we go. Okay. Back to the program. Okay. So if we take a look here, right, we're on the quest to 100,000. We're averaging almost 2,100 drone attacks per week. I did the math out and projected the rest of the year. Russians will probably hit like 97 to like 98,000 recorded drone attacks unless there's like a major change. Like if we start seeing like above 25 or 2,600, that could change things. But we've kind of been at this like 2,400-ish range the last couple weeks, which has brought our average up quite a bit because we've seen some dips recently below 2,000. Daily average of almost 300 total across the entire oblast. Now, if we take a look, right, like majority of these attacks are occurring outside of Kherson city itself, um, with almost 1,200 attacks on average, and per week and per day, we're hovering above 150, while inside it's around like 120, 125, 130, with a weekly average just under 900. If we take a look, some really impressive numbers in terms of destroyed drones, right? We see 30,000 of the 35,000 total inside the city have been destroyed. So that's fairly good, right? Especially when we get like a daily average of 109 out of 127 destroyed. That's looking pretty good inside the city. Outside the city, right, it's 134 to 168. So we're starting to see a bit of a gap there, right? 940 on a weekly average for intercepted drones out of 1179. We do see a bit of a differential there. And again, successful, right? Like successful attacks inside the city have dropped to under 20, which is huge. That speaks to the effectiveness of the unified electronic warfare system in Kherson, and also deployment of mobile fire groups and small arms units within the police force that and evacuation teams that help take down drones, and the deployment of smaller EW assets and drone detectors amongst municipal workers, volunteers, and first responders. So that really speaks to the success that Ukraine's had in the last like month and a half of drone interceptions, combined also with some rather sort of like wet weather. So we need to also keep in mind, right? Like this might not all just be due to improved EW or improved CUAS efforts just across the board. The factor of weather in drone warfare is very real. We saw that effect take place around the same time last year. Its effect was especially prominent in December when we saw Russian forces switching. Like there was the talk of the 300 boats and talks of potential landings and stuff like that the Russians might do, crossing the Dnipro and stuff like that. Never really materialized. The Russians lost those 300 boats in the sort of like piecemeal, one, two at a time assaults that we saw. They had lost 300 boats by about March, doing like 2 to 3 attacks a day. So we saw a major dip in casualties and reported drone attacks around that time because of weather and because Russian focus changed. So we may see something similar again this time around this year. But one thing I really want to point out, just not even with numbers, right? Just looking at the graph itself, I was talking about how when we start to get convergence of lines, that means the Ukrainians are doing well, right? So when our lines start to converge all at the same point, these are good things. And when our purple, black, and blue lines are going down, or at some of the lowest levels that we've seen yet, this is phenomenal, right? Because those are our successful Russian attacks. So we're seeing a major drop between last week and this week, and we're seeing this huge cluster of destroyed enemy drones, right? This is all destroyed enemy drones. So we're getting a clustering here of total attacks and destroyed drones. Total attacks, destroyed drones, right? Total attacks and destroyed drones. The closer that those corresponding pairs of lines come together, that means the more effective the Ukrainians are, or the less effective that the Russians are. Might be the more appropriate way to word that. So, things are looking good there. In terms of our averages overall, you can actually see here pretty well. It's actually larger. It's larger when we do it like this. Okay. When you look at the green column here, right, that's actual effectiveness outside Khersonska Hromada. You can see the dip that we were talking about where they dipped to just about 75%. It was like 76 and change percent effectiveness as compared to the effectiveness we were seeing like around like 85%. But 95%, right? In Khersonska Hromada, the yellow line, right? In Khersonska Hromada, we want to see that high. So overall, like average total, we're like for the whole year at about like 85% inside the city and just approaching 80% outside the city. And like total claimed effectiveness for the whole oblast, like just over 80% on the whole year. Just keep in mind when I was talking about total drone attacks, we do have two gaps in the data, three gaps really, but two gaps were back to back. So we may be in the territory of 100,000 drone attacks in Kherson Oblast this year. We just don't have data for 3 weeks. And those 3 weeks are statistically significant enough that it could actually push our total over to over 100,000, right? Because we were talking like something like 97 to 98,000 drone attacks just based on the average we have now. If we count in those 3 weeks, I'm almost certain we would break 100,000. So I would say you can safely assume that there will have been over 100,000 drone attacks in Kherson Rayon. Not Kherson Rayon, Kherson Oblast, in 2025 by the end of the year. Or realistically, probably by the start of December. Like, yeah. First week of December. Just doing the math in my head right now. Let's do our situation report. So, on 10th November, 5 civilians were wounded by Russian attacks. Drone attacks wounded 2 men, a 65-year-old man in Priozerna and a 55-year-old man in Kherson proper. 3 women were wounded by Russian shelling, a 57-year-old woman in Komashany and 2 women, 49 and 59, in Karabalny Rayon. 11th November marked Kherson's Liberation Day. If you guys are interested, you should check out our video from last week. Those of you who are watching this video probably saw the video from last week, I'd imagine. So you will already be up to date on Liberation Day. And you go to the end of last week's video, the companion video, and you can find my like sort of like I think I spent like 20 to 30 minutes talking about Liberation Day at the end of last week's video. So while residents remembered the now distant joy of Liberation Day 2022, Russian forces continued to carry out criminal attacks on the civilian population. 6 civilians were wounded by Russian attacks. 2 men sustained injuries from Russian drone attacks. An 83-year-old man wounded on the highway near Dorivka, and a 46-year-old municipal worker in Dniprovsky Rayon. 4 other civilians were injured from Russian shelling. 2 women Two men, 34 and 60, and a 33-year-old woman from Bilizerka, and a 67-year-old woman from Komishani. Russian shelling persisted in Bilizerka the next day, with 2 men, 62 and 66, wounded by Russian artillery. Further shelling wounded a 52-year-old man in Dniprovsky Raion, while a singular drone attack wounded a 47-year-old man in the same district. So you can see, right, like, not every day are we getting a dozen casualties currently. So there was a little bit of a let up this week, which is pretty fortunate because the last few weeks have been pretty brutal. There's at least 1 or 2 days that where the Russians just completely shell. We do see that this week, um, but it's not that things are getting better, but there's complications to the Russians having the sort of impact on the civilian population that they want to. Or that they're seeking to. One thing we did see, though, however, this week, there was one day where the news reports were just filled with reports of remote mining. So we're seeing the 98th engaged in that same remote mining campaign that we saw the 70th Motor Rifle Division engaged in. So they're like doing some of the same things that the 70th Motor Rifle Division were doing, but and the other thing is, like, but they don't, and they're covering for where the 104th were and for where part of the 70th division were, but they don't have the capabilities of the 104th. Like, the 104th were pretty effective overall, I would say, as a group. The 70th Motor Rifle Division, it depended on which drone group you were talking about as to how effective these guys were. So what I'm seeing here seems to be some sort of tactics from the 70th that we saw quite a bit in Antonivka and Dniprovsky Raion. And it seems right now they're really focusing on sort of like boxing in Dniprovsky Raion. And we can take a look at that actually on the map. You can see here on the 14th how very specific, again, when I was talking about choke points, I'm very serious about this. The Russians are looking to mine intersections where people have to take turns or major streets intersect with other major streets, and it helps box in the area, and then you get targets inside this box, inside the, this is the original red zone, the OG red zone declared by the Russians, if you even believe, in their ability to declare such a red zone. But yeah, you can see how they kind of use the mines to set up, right? All these pedal mines placed all around on Kulika Vulitsa, Uniwersytecka Vulitsa, Perakopska Vulitsa, Mira Vulitsa, Chornomorska Vulitsa, and Zalayechersa Vulitsa. Zalayechersa. Yeah, Zalayechersa Vulitsa. Okay, and the Beryslavska Highway. Yeah, this is a Hungarian name. Zalaegerszeg. Zalaegerszeg in Hungarian, I think is how they would pronounce it. But yeah, okay. On 13th November, Russian drones carried out mass remote mining of Dniprovsky Raion, prompting mass alerts across local telegram channels. As a result, 49-year-old police officer lost his foot due to the detonation of a Russian landmine, which Russian forces had remotely placed via a drone. In further criminal acts, Russian forces conducted remote mining using PFM-1 Lepestchak or Pelustka Belyustka anti-personnel mines, damaging and disabling 2 ambulances attempting to evacuate casualties. 2 men, 49 and 66, were wounded by drones in Dniprovsky Raion as well. A 36-year-old woman was wounded by Russian shelling in Belozerka. The first fatality of the week came on 14th November when Russian drones killed a 62-year-old man and wounded a 33-year-old man in Dniprovsky Raion. Russian shelling in Komishany wounded a 65-year-old couple and a 27-year-old man. 4 civilians were killed by Russian shelling on 15th November. An 88-year-old woman in Dniprovsky Raion, a 37-year-old man in Makhilska, a 75-year-old man in Kherson Raion, and a 51-year-old man in Centralny Raion. West of Kherson, a 53-year-old man in Belozerka and a 61-year-old woman in Komishany were wounded by Russian shelling. A 51-year-old female medical worker and a 70-year-old man were wounded by Russian shelling in the center of Kherson. In Karabalny Raion, 2 men, 57 and 72, and a 84-year-old woman were wounded by Russian shelling. Shelling in the Dniprovsky Raion wounded 3 women, 52, 63, and 65 years old, and a 55-year-old man, while Russian drone strikes wounded 2 men, 37 and 56, in the same district. Here we have some footage from the shelling of the village of Makhilska, where we saw the death of a 37-year-old man on that day. He was the only casualty reported, and this is video shared from the very same day. We do have another video of shelling in this area as well, but it's likely that one of the 2 videos does show the instances of shelling that potentially killed this man. So we can see the indiscriminate shelling of, well, indiscriminate perhaps, but more than likely drone-guided shelling of Makhilska. Wherever there's civilian movement, we see artillery strikes sent. So oftentimes, when a target is not hit with a drone or cannot be hit with a drone, we do see Mavics like this one spotting for artillery units in the rear. In this area, it's probably the 74th Artillery Brigade, but it could be an artillery asset at Army Corps level or Combined Arms Army level. Okay. And here we saw a strike on the 16th. To end the week, Russian drones wounded a 61-year-old ambulance driver, a 32-year-old medic, 3 men, 51, 52, and 58, and a 57-year-old woman in Dniprovsky Raion. 3 men were wounded in this vehicle here. The 51, 52, and 58-year-old men were hit by a drone here. Russian shelling wounded 2 civilians, an 87-year-old woman in Belozerka and a 45-year-old woman, 45-year-old man in Dniprovsky Raion. Russian drone operators attacked another ambulance that day without casualties. In Berezovsky Raion, a 78-year-old man was killed by a Russian drone in Osokorivka, and a 43-year-old woman in Novomykolaievka was wounded by falling debris from a Russian Gran 2 Shahed-136 kamikaze drone. So only 2 people were wounded in Berezovsky Raion this week. If we take a look, that was on the 12th and the 14th, respectively. Okay. And yes, just casualties. Feel free to take a look at the full list, and all of my data is available in the links below. Miscellaneous shelling and bombing killed 4 people in Kherson Raion and wounded another 27, including that medical worker that we heard about. Small UAS, SUAS, small drones, FPVs, Mavics, and Molnias killed 1 person and wounded 16, including 2 medical workers and a municipal worker. Nobody in Kherson Raion was wounded or killed by Haran or Shahed drones. And landmines or UXO only wounded the singular police officer who sustained amputation of his foot. So for Kherson Raion, we have a total of 49 casualties, 5 killed, 44 wounded. Moving into Beryaslav, we have the 1 killed by a drone, an old man killed in Osokorivka, which Osokorivka is all the way up here. So likely in the village or along the road here. The coastal road here comes under attack quite frequently. And a 43-year-old woman in Novomykolaievka. Now, Novomykolaievka is not really a super popular place, so people might not know about it, but it was here, right? It was here that happened. So, total for the whole oblast, we had 51 casualties, 6 killed, 45 wounded. Some aftermath, some pictures of shelling in Berislav from 11th November. This week, we saw 17 apartment buildings, 108 houses, one cargo box that goes on top of your automobile. That was reported. 3 garages, 2 outbuildings, 4 natural gas pipelines, a piece of railway infrastructure, 2 medical facilities, a utility company, 4 critical infrastructure facilities, 1 hospital, an administrative building, a store, 2 educational institutions, a summer kitchen, a power line or set of power lines, a utility facility, and a shopping kiosk. In terms of damaged vehicles, here you can see actually the ambulance shredded tire. They're replacing the wheel on the ambulance that ran over one of the pedal landmines. And here you can see a skid drop that put a hole through the front of a police car. Right, you can see how it dropped in and then fragmented out. Right, an FPV wouldn't do that. An FPV would have absolutely blown that whole thing up. Okay. And 6 police cars, 17 civilian automobiles, 2 buses were hit with no casualties on the bus attacks. Despite the bus attacks being a method of causing or an attempt to cause mass casualty events, the bus attacks were unsuccessful at doing so this week. Not even the drivers were wounded, thankfully. 1 truck and our 4 ambulances. Remember, Kherson will never be a Russian city. Share, subscribe, leave a comment, share my publication. You can access all of my sources here. And you can also check out, I know we didn't talk about it in this video, but if we go to the homepage, issue 2 of Red Zone Ukraine is out. It was a bad week, not as bad as the week before. If you guys just want to hang around 1 second, we saw 22 people killed, really deadly week, 53 people wounded, for a total of 75 casualties. So not close to 100 like it was last week, but really a deadly week, mostly driven by a really, really bloody week in Kherson. Mostly the 2 deaths we saw this past week. And Zaporizhia, yeah. And Kharkiv. Pretty brutal. Sumy was actually, all things considered, pretty tame. 6 wounded in Sumy, 5 killed and 8 wounded in Kharkiv, 3 killed and 9 wounded in Donetsk, 8 killed, 3 wounded in Zaporizhia, 2 killed and 10 wounded in Dnipropetrovsk, and 4 killed, 17 wounded in Kherson for a total of 21. So we saw on the 11th, data labels are wrong. On the 11th, we saw 9, 11, and then 7, 14, 24, 18, and 9 casualties throughout the week from the 9th to the 15th. And 6, 21, 13, 12, 12, and 11 for our oblasts, respectively. So that's all I have for you guys. Have a good one.